Hey everyone, Tactics here, and in this video I'm going to be covering every single important dispel across all 8 Season 2 Mythic Plus dungeons to help you have a great start to the Undermined patch. Know that I will not be covering bleeds here, as that's a bit of a unique case when it comes to dispelling, and instead I'm going to focus on the usual magic, poison, disease, and curse debuffs. If you're interested in similar videos on interrupts or tank busters, full dungeon guides with all the abilities in a specific dungeon, or just an easy to read spreadsheet that displays all of the information you need, I've got all those things and more over on my channel and linked down in the description below, so check those out. And let's get started here with our first dungeon, the Rookery, where there's a couple magic debuffs as well as a curse to be aware of. Starting with that curse, it's from the Corrupted Oracles, which appear between the first and the second boss, and it's a random target ability in Seeping Corruption. This is a dot that also spawns circles underneath the targeted player every 2 seconds for the 8-second duration. So you have a curse or spell, get rid of these quickly, and if you don't, make sure the targeted player is ready to move away from these circles as they spawn. In terms of the magic debuffs, both those are present in the back half of the dungeon, with the Void Ascendant mobs having the Feasting Void ability. This is a magic dot as well as a healing absorb that applies to all players, so you can remove this with magic dispels, but you can also remove this just by healing that debuff off. Finally, the last boss, Voidstone Monstrosity, is one of those bosses that throws out 2 magic debuffs at a time. This one is called Unleash Corruption, and it's a 15-second magic dot that also leaves a puddle on the ground when dispelled. So you want to dispel these relatively quickly so that you can get both of them without letting them expire, but you also want to make sure that the players are away from melee and just not clogging up space in the room, so the puddles they create don't prevent you from doing any of the other boss mechanics. Moving on to Priory, there's actually not a lot to talk about in this dungeon because a lot of the dispels are avoidable. There's quite a few like circles on the ground that will give people magic debuffs, so just, avoid that. The important one is actually a tank related one in Divine Judgment. This is from one of the mini bosses, Elena Emberlands, and this is a 25% damage taken increase on the tank, so you want to make sure you dispel that as quickly as you can. Otherwise, everything else is either a bleed or avoidable in some way. So we're going to move on then to Darkflame Cleft, where we have more magic debuffs in the first area. The Royal Wicklighters will throw out flashpoint dots onto random players, so just dispel as many of those as you can. And there's also pack moles in this area, which have a disease dispel on the tank again in Nasty Nibble. This is a damage taken increase, so you really want to make sure if there's any disease dispels available, they have those for the tank. Other than that, once again, a couple avoidable magic dispels, so we're not going to talk about those. We're going to instead move over to Cinderbrew. In that first area, there is a caster that throws out dots. That is the Ventrico Pyromaniac, and the dot is Erupting Inferno. This also deals splash damage to players within 5 yards, so loose spread here is good, and dispelling as many of these as possible, also very good as a healer. Ipa is a boss that has an important magic dispel in Burning Fermentation. This again goes out on 2 players. It's a very long 16-second dot, so you want to dispel one early, and then the other one when your dispel is off cooldown here. No puddles or anything like the Rookery boss to be aware of, so just quickly dispel this. Moving towards Bank Busby, there's a ton of these small Beelit mobs, and they have a passive in Bee Venom, which stacks up a magic dot on the tank, so you want to be aware of these stacks and dispel the tank on cooldown here just to reduce that damage. Finally, the last boss in Goldie Baronbottom also puts out a couple magic debuffs. This is from the Burning Ricochet ability. Targets 2 players, and once it detonates, it puts a magic buff on each of them. This is a very short, only 6-second duration here, so you can only dispel one of the 2 debuffed players, so you're going to have to pick wisely. Moving on to Operation Floodgate, we have another tank targeted magic dot here in Blood Infused Strikes. Again, stacks up on the tank similar to that Bee Venom, but a little bit slower here, so keep dispels on this ability. Otherwise, the first important dispel will come from the Demolition Duo boss. That is in the form of Kinetic Explosive Gel. This debuffs a random player, and then once dispelled, it explodes in a 5-yard AoE, which also knocks bombs out of the arena. So you want to dispel this quickly, but you do want to make sure you are removing some of the bombs on the platform when you do so. Otherwise, you do blow up. So you can have players pre-position here so that you can get this dispel off ASAP. Moving down towards the last boss, there's another Dispel from the Venture Co. Electricians, and this is Overcharge. This goes out on random players. It's a 12-second dot, and if it ever expires, it will stun the target for a decent amount of time. So you want to make sure you're dispelling every single one of these. Then we get to the Motherlode, where we get our first poison dispels from the Venture Co. Alchemist. Their caustic compound targets a random player. It's a poison dot, so you can just dispel this. It's no longer interruptible. Only dispels will work here. They do have an interrupt in Transmute Goo, which is a magic debuff, so if it ever goes out, you have a magic dispel available for that, but usually you're going to want to be kicking that and dispelling the poisons if possible. Workshop is a dungeon that has quite a few magic specific debuffs. So on the trash just before Cujo, you got the Junkyard Dogs and their Fiery Jaws ability. Targets a random player. It's a 10-second magic dot, so keep as many dispels on that as possible. You're not going to be able to get all of them here because there's usually quite a few dogs in a single pull, but get as many as you can. Then Cujo himself, of course, has a very nasty dot in Blazing Chomp. This is on the tank initially, but when it's dispelled, it does a group hit. So you want to dispel this quickly, but you want to make sure that everyone is topped when it does actually get dispelled. Finally, moving towards the later half of the dungeon, you've got defense bots. Both Mark 1 and Mark 3 will put out the Arcing Zap dot. It's a pretty long 20-second magic dot that goes out. So again, kind of a situation where you're not going to be able to get every single one of these, but you want to get as many as you can, and then people will need to use defensives if you're getting overwhelmed or if the AoE damage is happening at the same time. And then that brings us to the last dungeon, Theater of Pain, which has by far the most dispels out of any dungeon this season. To start, first boss, Withering Touch will go out on 2 players here. Magic dot, so that is something you want to dispel quickly again, and then get the second one if you can in the back half, where they can just use a defensive and eat that duration. Moving down, going towards Cult the Rock Swing, you're going to get a Dangerous Curse and Shadow Vulnerability. This doesn't do anything on its own besides increase shadow damage taken, but it lasts for 30 seconds and is very dangerous in combination with some of the random target bolt or AoE damage in this area. So if you have a Curse spell, it is quite useful for that. Otherwise, those players are going to need to be ready to use a defensive. Also in this area is another curse called Curse of Desolation. This is from the Nefarious Darkspeaker mobs. It's not super dangerous in terms of the damage it outputs, but it does drop a lot of circles underneath the targeted player every 3 seconds for 18 seconds that fear any one hit. So that person's going to want to be ready to move constantly as those circles drop. I do also want to quickly note at the end of this wing, Cult the Rock was previously a boss that put out magic buffs, or debuffs rather. No longer the case, so you're not going to need to worry about dispelling that. Instead, we can move towards Gorechop's wing, where all the diseases are. So you've got a tank targeted disease here from the Disease Horror. That's the Decaying Strike ability. This is a max health reduction and dot on the tank. So if you have a disease spell, again, very good to help your tank take less damage in this area. Blighted Sludge Spewers have the Decaying Filth ability. This is an interrupt, but you're probably not going to be able to interrupt all of these. So again, just if you have a disease spell that isn't on the tank already, you can use it on this dot that it puts out. You should be interrupting your Withering Discharge. That puts out the AoE disease dot on the group, but shouldn't have to worry about that. Other than that, there's a couple more diseases on the ground that you should be able to avoid, as well as, a curse from the last boss, which again should be totally avoidable. So that is it for this video. Hopefully it helps you out this season. If it does, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more guide content, including Keystone Legend route walkthroughs with commentary, Liberation of Undermine raid guides, and much more. Of course, I need to thank all of my Patreon supporters for making this content possible. Could not do it without you, so thank you, and I'll see everyone in the next video.